The Galactic Empire communications hall was silent when the first strange signal appeared, and it was so weak that most of the junior operators thought it was only background noise, and one young operator in training named Ares Julian looked at the pattern again because he was bored and because he wanted to impress his supervisor, and he noticed that the wave shape had a strange steady rhythm, and he slowly leaned closer, and he used his simple low-level software to clean the background. Hiss and the pattern stayed, and he whispered to his supervisor that something was there. And his supervisor did not even look at the screen at first because he thought it was only another rock reflecting a coded navigation beacon, and he only looked because he wanted to avoid a small lecture from his superior later. And the supervisor's eyes narrowed, and he called for the chief officer in charge of this monitoring shift, and the chief officer walked over with slow steps because he did not want to run and make it look like excitement. And the chief officer only needed 2 seconds to confirm that this pattern was not natural and not imperial. And he did not even say anything when he stopped breathing for a second, because he felt the hairs on his neck rise, and he knew instinct fear like a small animal knows predators. And he moved to the emergency console and reported a silent alert to the central command node. And he wrote that this was not scheduled traffic, but an unknown object moving through deep space at extreme speed. And he wanted to write that it felt wrong, but he did not write that because feeling words are not allowed in official alerts, and the Empire had always taught that emotions must be removed from investigations, and analysis, and the pattern seemed to show a repeating binary pulse that was steady, like it had intent, and the object was moving with a speed that was too high for any known engine type. And every person in that hall now watched the same screen with very slow breaths because even the air felt heavier than before. And nobody dared to speak because they all felt shame to think that fear was inside them, and fear was not an accepted skill in Imperial service. And the central command node responded, and it said that this contact would be investigated by Code Black Classified, and that all local recordings would be sealed and rerouted for high-level review. And this message made everyone swallow dry because Code Black Classification only existed in theory, and nobody knew anyone who had ever seen it used in real life, and the entire tracking was then shifted to a high-level analyst building that was hidden inside a Black Moon research station. And that was the moment when the Empire first learned the impossible detail, because the high-level analyst team discovered biological emissions inside the detection signature, and the only species in the known catalog that emitted that exact combination of elements and isotopes was humans. And the Empire had long believed that humans had been a low-skill species with little technology and small, short lives, and they were not considered relevant in any galactic age, and the Empire believed humans never developed real deep space capability, and that they never had strong energy sources, and they never had singularity-level architecture. And the Empire believed humans had no star-forging engines and no supercluster access, and many Imperial schoolbooks even stated that humans were a species that failed before they even started. And so when the Imperial Command saw that the biological emission signature matched this small, extinct primitive species, they assumed that the detection equipment was damaged, and they sent out emergency calibration scan drones to confirm the signal from 3 different angles. And the drones confirmed everything, and suddenly the entire board of directors of the Imperial military were called into a secret session. And it happened late at night, which was never allowed because board meetings are always scheduled in the daylight cycle with strict protocol. And this sudden break in protocol made every admiral's stomach feel sick because the Empire never breaks protocol unless something is very, very bad. And one admiral tried to speak a joke to calm the table, but no one laughed. And he felt the joke die inside his throat. And then he felt fear settle like cold air in his lungs, and the high-level data stream was played on a large wall screen, and the signature of the ship showed that the unknown object was the size of a destroyer-class warship, but the power core emission mapped to something that looked like a singularity, but smaller and more stable, and nobody believed it. And no empire in known memory had ever stabilized something like that in such a small form. And humans were believed to be so small and weak that they could not even leave their small ecosystem correctly. And that belief was the foundation of every imperial historical record about the human species. And one of the admirals began to doubt all imperial archives, and his hands shook, and he remembered old propaganda when he was a child, that humans were not even a danger, to themselves, and now the board watched a super-dense hull around the unknown object, and this hull had density values that were absurd, and this hull should have collapsed under its own mass, and the board made a large cross-test because they believed the physics kernel was broken, and this test said the same thing, and the hull still looked real. And every projection model said that the weapons on this unknown ship could cut an entire moon in half with one single beam, and the interstellar empires that fought against each other for resources never had anything like this, and this was worse than fear. It was humiliation, and this humiliation was personal, because these admirals and these scientists had spent their entire lives saying that human beings were a failure, and now the numbers were saying that humanity had returned with something so advanced that it did not even look like technology anymore, and they were so far above any empire that the technology looked like magic, and nobody wanted to be the first person to ask the question, but someone finally did, and he asked if this unknown ship was actually human, and silence hit them again like a physical punch, and when the room finally accepted the truth, the panic had already begun, because the Empire always believed it was the most advanced, and now the Empire was only shocked prey, and its enemy was something they believed extinct and dead and weak and pathetic. And this was the moment where the Empire felt something it had not felt for ages, and that feeling was raw primal terror, and they did not even know how to fight something like that, because how do you fight a ghost from a dead world that returns with power that breaks physics and breaks pride and breaks certainty? And the unknown object kept flying closer, and its signal grew stronger, and nobody understood what was coming next, and every person in every command hall waited and listened and feared the next message. The Imperial analysts waited for the next signal, because they now knew this object was not only real but also controlled by someone, and they were not ready for the message that finally came, and it appeared as a compressed transmission that looked like radio, but it was too clean and too stable to be old radio, and it showed that the unknown ship was deliberately announcing something, and the pattern decoded into symbols, and the symbols were Old English words, and the reason this created a cold shock was simple, because nobody in this age used English, and no Empire school taught English, and the only place English existed was inside old forgotten archives from pre-collapse psychology studies about an old small species, and the analysts sat frozen in front of their screens, because they now understood that the unknown warship wanted to speak directly, and the first decoded sentence was simple, and it said return vector locked, and every person in that lab felt like ice, because this sounded like the ship was not lost, and not wandering and not random, but instead it was coming back on purpose, and this meant someone had a destination. And analysts searched for earlier human records to cross-check, and they discovered that humans used to speak in very short, direct sentences, and this first message fit that pattern, and it made the human signature more real and more direct. And this was the moment one admiral in the high command room whispered that if humanity can send this ship, then we never understood anything about them. And in that room there were no arguments, because no one wanted to believe humans were still here, and that they were now so advanced that they looked like a myth. And the warship kept moving closer, and it kept sending small short pulses that were like someone knocking on a locked door to warn before entering. And some of the code breakers thought maybe the ship was asking for landing rights or clearance, and some of them thought maybe the ship was warning the Empire to step aside, because it was going to pass through, and nobody knew which idea was worse. And sometimes fear is more powerful when it is quiet, and this fear spread through every security channel, because the Empire had always believed it was the strongest, and now the Empire felt weak and empty, like a child holding a wood stick, while a giant holding a star hammer stood in front of him, and the Imperial Council argued silently inside a sealed room to decide if they should send a message back to this unknown human ship, and one minister said that if they send anything they might make the humans angry, and another minister said that if they do not send anything then the humans will think the Empire is ignoring them, and they might see this as hostile. And this argument kept looping because every option felt like a trap, and nobody had the courage to make a move. And in another floor of the same building, young military strategists were doing silent calculations, and they tried to simulate a battle between a standard Imperial fleet and this unknown human warship, and every simulation ended in total destruction in less than 1 second. And the weapon signature that the ship carried looked like a linear moon cutter, and this weapon type was described only in old speculative papers. But those papers claimed that such a weapon was only a joke concept and not something anyone could build. And these young strategists stopped the simulation because the result was too shameful and too shocking, because the Empire always believed it was the top predator. But now the Empire understood that being the top predator only matters until a higher predator shows up. And in the lower city levels, people on the street felt that something was wrong. And even though they had no knowledge of the secret, arrival. The fear moved through the Empire like invisible smoke because humans had a myth inside the Empire, like old legends about a species that could do impossible things. And some people whispered long ago that humans may have been the creators of forbidden technology, and they may have been the ones who shaped the first jump gates. But the Empire deleted these tales from schools because they made humans look too powerful, and now those old deleted stories began to return again, and people heard rumors, and rumors turned into fear, and fear turned into panic cycles. And in the private estate of the Central Emperor, the Emperor himself paced the hall, and he asked his most trusted scientist if this was really a human ship. And the scientist answered with a small shake of his head because he did not want to speak the word yes out loud, because that one word could break the Emperor's mental balance. And the Emperor whispered that this cannot be happening, and the scientist did not answer because he knew that silence was safer. And when the Emperor asked if the Empire should launch a peace beacon, the scientist dropped his eyes because the idea sounded like a child trying to speak to a mountain. And this made the Emperor breathe, like a tired old man, because this felt like the Empire was now an ant colony, trying to talk to a supernova. And the Emperor wanted to order the ship destroyed, but he did not say it because he thought that if the human ship could slice a moon in one shot, then a destroy order would bring the end of the Empire. And in that moment the Emperor realized that a silent war has started, and the war was not about weapons, but about fear. And now the Imperial Intelligence Office attempted a test message back to the ship, and they kept the message short because they did not want to anger whoever controlled that ship. And the message contained only one simple line, and it said, "Identify origin." And this message was sent, and then the entire Empire waited, again like prey waiting for a predator to turn its head. And the reply came back in less than 1 second, and the reply simply said, "Origin Earth." And this was the moment where every old myth became truth, because Earth was the name of the forgotten human homeworld. And now this fact was undeniable, and the Empire felt small and soft like paper in a storm, and there was nothing left to argue because the one enemy that every empire mocked and laughed at and ignored as a footnote in old star charts had returned, and not as the weak species that once walked on a small blue planet, but as something greater, something beyond, and something terrifying. And all sectors of the Empire now understood that the future had arrived, and it was wearing the face of ancient humanity, and the unknown ship continued moving forward. And the Empire did not know what would happen when it reached the borderline, because maybe the ship would pass, and maybe it would stop, and maybe it would speak more, and maybe it would burn everything ahead of it, and nobody knew. And this silent tension filled the Empire like a slow-burning fire, and nobody slept, and nobody felt safe anymore. And the Empire had stepped into a new age, and they were not ready for it. The Imperial military leadership demanded a full scientific analysis of the unknown ship, because they wanted to understand how any ship could create power so strong that it could distort basic readings. And the senior engineers first believed the scans were wrong because every result that came back looked like impossible fiction, and even the most advanced Imperial warships did not have energy cores that could create stable, singular structures. And yet this human ship was reading as a small singularity core that did not collapse and did not leak and did not destabilize. And this was the moment the scientists realized that human technology had crossed a line that no empire had ever reached, and even worse, this ship was using hull material that was denser than neutron armor. And neutron armor was already considered the most advanced armor ever built in this galaxy. And to see something even denser made every scientist feel small and stupid. And some scientists whispered that maybe humans had left the physical laws behind, and maybe they had discovered some new type of matter state that no one had ever imagined. And this idea was terrifying, because if humans had discovered new matter states, then they could invent new realities, and if they could invent new realities, then they could erase old ones. And this meant that the Empire could be deleted like a file inside a computer. And the Empire would not even understand how it happened. And in the weapons analysis tower, the security team watched the projection of the weapon spike coming from the human warship, And this spike was the thing that had the simulation rating of mooncutter capability. And some engineers ran a test model to see how much damage this weapon could do to an Imperial planet if fired at half power. And the numbers showed that the planet would crack like glass, and every person in that room tasted fear, because the Empire was now living inside a belief that humans were weak. But now they were learning that humans might be something that was once weak, but then became unstoppable. And the Imperial soldiers refused to speak loudly because if they said the fear out loud, then the fear would become real. And in the council, all the admirals tried to write a rational breakdown of the threat profile. But no sentence looked rational anymore, because none of the numbers fit the known database, and the numbers were so far beyond understanding that they made the database look like a joke, and one admiral tried to say that maybe this object was not human, and maybe it only used human words because someone wanted to create confusion, but the linguistic analysts said no, because the language was too natural and too pattern-perfect to be artificial, and every phoneme matched archived human English. And this meant that someone alive or something derived from humanity had written that message, and now the Empire had to face the possibility that a species that was supposed to be small and unimportant had returned with a superweapon fleet, and this meant the Empire was not the top of the hierarchy. And that was something the Empire never learned how to accept, because the Empire had spent entire ages believing that it was the strongest, and now that belief was dead and in another sealed chamber, the psychological division of the Empire wrote an emergency briefing that warned that the Empire might collapse socially if the real information leaked into public channels, because fear at this scale could break 1 trillion citizens and no empire could survive if its people believed an unstoppable force was about to arrive and destroy everything. And some generals tried to say that the Empire should prepare a first strike because maybe only a first strike could make humans afraid again. But this was shut down, because the simulations showed that first strike would fail, and then the Empire would die. And this truth made everyone feel helpless, because the Empire had never been helpless before. And now the Empire was a child staring at a monster that did not even care about the child. And the Imperial Defense Fleet was placed on silent alert because the Empire wanted to look ready. But the fleet commanders knew that the fleet was not ready at all, and that this alert was only decoration for pride and not real safety, because when a wolf faces a storm, there is no shelter. And in a low-orbit station above the capital world, a security officer named Ilar stood by a viewport, and he watched the stars, and he wondered how humans could have changed so much. And he remembered old-school propaganda that said humans were small and emotional creatures that cried and fought and screamed over small things, and that they were not a danger. And now he wondered if that propaganda was written to hide something. And maybe the Empire had always known that humans could become monsters. And maybe the Empire erased the truth from history because the truth made them afraid. And if that was true, then the Empire had been lying to itself for centuries. And Ilar felt small and weak, and he whispered to himself that maybe humans had gone somewhere far beyond the galaxy and learned things that no one else could ever learn, and then they returned to show that they were the highest power of all, and this whisper felt like cold ice. And he walked away from the viewport with slow steps, because he felt like the sky itself was watching him. And inside the Central Intelligence Archive, a specialist discovered a small old file that showed a rumor that humans once tried to create weapons that could kill stars, and the file was marked as a myth. But now the specialist wondered if the myth was actually a truth that was erased to stop panic. And now panic was here anyway, because the humans were coming, and there was no place to hide and no place to run, and the Empire had no way to defend itself, because when the enemy can bend physical law, then no fortress can survive. And in every layer of Imperial life, the fear was growing even before the first official announcement, and the Empire could not hide the incoming shock forever, because when the human warship crossed the outer border sensors, the smaller worlds would see it themselves, and they would report it, and then panic would explode like a spreading fire, and the Empire now understood that the only thing keeping this panic silent was the fact that the ship was still far from populated zones, but that distance was closing, and the Empire was running out of time, and there was no plan, and no strategy, and no hope, because this was not a normal fleet. This was a god machine, built by a species that no one understood, and maybe this was only one ship, and maybe more were behind it, waiting in the dark, and the Empire feared that this was not an accident and not a scout and not a stray vessel, but maybe this was a quiet warning shot that humanity had returned, and now everyone waited for what would happen when the human ship finally crossed into the Empire heartlands, because maybe that moment would change the galaxy forever. The fear inside the Empire government changed into panic that they tried to hide because they knew that if the public saw even one small sign of fear, then every street in every city would break into chaos and riots, and the Emperor ordered that every broadcast station must remove any topic related to unknown contact, even in comedy and even in trivial shows, because he knew that a joke is sometimes enough to make fear feel real. And now, he was learning that fear travels faster than any starship, and the imperial ministers were instructed to lock their doors and to not speak to anyone outside the government, and they agreed because they also feared their own voices. And deep inside, the military quarter, the Empire Black Operations Unit gathered to discuss what action could be taken against the possible human return. And the Black Operations Unit was considered the most dangerous group in the Empire because they had permission to perform actions that the law did not allow, and even they looked weak now, because all their special ships and hidden assassination drones looked useless against the new threat, and one commander tried to suggest a boarding mission because he thought that the unknown ship might not be prepared for a silent stealth latch, but he was ignored because nobody believed that a ship that could carry a singularity core would fail to detect a small boarding craft. And this commander felt humiliated, and he said nothing again because he knew that his suggestion made him look like a child. And in the Empire culture, looking like a child is equal to death for a career. And while this was happening in the deep core of the government, something more dangerous was happening in the lower social layers, because rumors had started moving between citizens like a secret storm, and people whispered that humans were coming, and some whispered that humans were ancient gods, and some whispered that humans were destroyers who erased galaxies. And it did not matter which rumor was true, because each rumor created more fright, and more fright created more chaos, and secret police forces started catching citizens who continued to repeat the word human, because the government feared that the word human would become a trigger for mass collapse. And in the security hall near the Imperial throne, a low officer asked a silent question to his superior, and he asked if he should prepare shutdown protocols for dark city districts, because dark districts usually riot first in crisis, and his superior said do nothing yet. And this answer did not feel like strategy. It felt like surrender. And this answer stayed inside the low officer's mind because it showed that even the superior officer had no solid plan anymore. And the High Admiral of the fleet was inside his private room, staring at a hologram of the unknown warship. And this hologram was the one thing he feared more than death, because he had spent his entire life telling everyone that the Empire fleet was the strongest weapon force in the galaxy. And now that Empire fleet looked tiny and useless compared to a single human warship, and the High Admiral slowly sat down in his chair because his knees felt heavy and weak like old metal, and he whispered to himself that he could not believe humans had returned, and he tried to remember his training when he was young, and he remembered a very old secret lecture where one old general said that humans might not be weak at all, and that humans might have vanished from recorded space not because they were destroyed, but because they left to explore something bigger, and that maybe they would return one day. And he remembered that this lecture was removed from all official books, and that the general who spoke it was later dismissed from service. And now he wondered if that lecture was actually true. And maybe the old general was the only one who understood the real truth about humans, and this thought made the High Admiral feel small, and his hands trembled because the foundation of his belief was now broken. And finally, a secret reports came from Imperial intelligence that small independent border groups who lived near the arrival zone had already submitted surrender declarations to humans, even though humans had not arrived yet. And this fact was the most terrifying of all, because it meant that some people believed that surrender could be done early to save their lives, and these small groups had sent encoded messages into deep space that said, "We surrender to Earth on behalf of our entire sector." And they believed that these messages would reach the human ship before the Empire could react, and this action by civilians felt like betrayal. But it was also logical because survival is stronger than loyalty. And in the Empire there was a new fear that more worlds would surrender before the human ship even reached the border, and this would make the Empire look powerless, and the Emperor was now sitting alone, and his face was pale, and his eyes looked like he had aged many decades in one cycle, and he told his guard that this cannot be happening. And the guard did not answer, because a guard cannot correct the emperor and he cannot comfort him either. And the emperor said that he felt like the world around him was not real anymore because everything he believed in now looked like a weak illusion. And he said that the empire was supposed to be the final power in history, but instead, it was now only a soft creature standing in front of an ancient force that was greater and deadlier and much more real. And the Imperial Science Council sent a new scan model that showed that human weapons could destroy an entire Imperial armada in a blink, and that there was no countermeasure because every possible energy shield would collapse instantly like paper hit by fire. And the admirals stared at that report, and their minds almost refused to accept it, because it meant war was impossible and surrender was the only real choice. But surrender to who? Because the humans had not even asked for surrender yet. And the unknown human ship was still silent now, and this silence was more frightening than any open message could ever be. And the Empire felt like prey, trapped under the shadow of a predator that had not even attacked yet. And every person in power now stood in quiet terror, because this was how real power feels, and maybe humans were not only returning to reclaim what they once had, but maybe humans were returning because everything in this galaxy was already theirs. And the Empire was not a strong civilization but only an occupant inside, territory that belonged to the ancient children of Earth. The unknown human warship continued to move closer, and it finally sent another transmission. And this message was not a long one, and it did not contain any threat or any demand or any explanation. And yet this short message was the most frightening thing the Empire had ever received, and this message said, "We are returning. This galaxy is still ours." And every person who saw that single line could feel their lungs freeze, because the message did not ask anything. It simply declared ownership, and this was more dangerous than any threat because a threat at least suggests that someone might want something in return. But a declaration means that the humans already believed everything in this galaxy belonged to them. And the Imperial High Council stared at that message, and not a single word was spoken, because there was nothing left to say, because the humans had spoken like old rulers, who had returned to a land that was stolen from them. And now the Empire understood that this was not revenge, and this was not diplomacy, and this was not negotiation, because this was a claim, and a claim backed by power so high that nobody in the Empire could imagine a counterplay. And when this message leaked into a restricted military server, the panic that followed moved like a virus because the officers who saw it felt their minds collapse, and some officers who were normally calm and logical began to shout and argue, and one officer hit his head against the wall because he said that there was no reason to fight anymore, because how can a candle fight a star? And a general told them to be silent, because fear is contagious, and if fear spreads, then the entire empire will die without even a single human weapon firing. And the general tried to calm his own heart, but his hand shook anyway. And in the outer border, a small mining outpost saw the human ship come into visual range, and the miners were not soldiers, and they were not trained in military discipline, and they were not told to stay silent about the human arrival, because the Empire still believed they had more time. And so the miners did the thing that every government feared, and they sent a live broadcast to all the other small settlements in that region, and they did not use encryption because normal workers do not think about encryption, and within seconds millions of people saw the image of a sleek, dark ship that looked like it was built from some impossible black matter that did not reflect light correctly. And this ship did not look like a machine. It looked like a living shadow. And some people thought it was a god, and some thought it was a demon, and some thought it was death itself. And panic spread before the Empire could silence the broadcast, because fear is always faster than authority. And Imperial emergency police started to shut down broadcast towers. And they arrested the miners who sent the images, and they tried to isolate every witness. But it was too late, because those images had already spread. And every person who saw the ship felt like the Empire was only a small fragile toy that could be crushed at any moment, and some of the outer worlds began sending surrender messages on their own because they thought that surrendering early might save them. And this was the exact nightmare the Empire feared. And in the capital world, the Emperor paced the floor in his private office, and he asked a simple question, without lifting his eyes. And he asked, what if the humans do not want negotiation? What if they only want to take back what is theirs? And Nobody answered because nobody had an answer. And one minister finally said that the empire must offer something valuable to prove respect. But the emperor said, "What can we offer to a species that can build ships, that break the laws of physics?" And that minister lowered his head because he understood that there was nothing the empire could offer, because nothing had value in the presence of absolute power. And meanwhile, the scientists in the weapons division tried to analyze the message, pattern, and called it a psychological weapon because the sentence structure was designed to trigger fear and submission in any mind that still held pride. And this message was a master stroke because humans had not fired any weapons, and yet they had already forced entire sectors to surrender without a battle. And the psychological division labeled this as existential warfare, and they wrote that this was a war fought with fear directly injected into the minds of the enemy. And they wrote that humans had mastered the art of domination without needing to fire a single shot. And the empire had never seen or experienced a war like this, because the empire always fought with fleets and armies and planets. And here was an enemy that fought with words and existence and presence. And the fleet admirals looked at the map and saw that the human ship was moving toward the imperial heart worlds. But its path was not straight, and this path looked like it was drawn with intent like this. Ship was passing close to certain sectors that were known for rebellion, and they thought maybe this was a message to those sectors, because these sectors had always talked about fighting the empire, and now those same rebels saw something stronger than the empire, and they saw a real monster, and even the bravest rebels dropped their weapons and they sent surrender messages to the humans, because they believed that humans would crush the empire, and they wanted to survive under the new rulers. And this was the worst scenario because it meant the empire was losing territory without combat. And this war was not a war between fleets. It was a war between belief and terror. And the emperor now understood that humans were not acting with random movement, because humans were using fear as a weapon, and this warship was moving through space like a knife moving through soft flesh, and every planet it passed fell into fear, and every world that heard the message, "We are returning this galaxy," is still ours, began to see humans as inevitable overlords, and now the empire was losing control of its own subjects because terror had become the new ruler. And the emperor sat down in silence, and he felt like he was a prisoner inside his own palace because he could not run and he could not fight and he could not speak. And this moment was the death of pride because the empire was no longer the greatest force in this galaxy. And for the first time in imperial history, every admiral, every minister, every soldier, every citizen felt the same truth. Humans had returned and the galaxy belonged to them. The historians of the empire later wrote that the moment the human warship reached the inner belt of the empire was not a moment of war, but a moment of surrender, because no battle happened and no shields were raised and no weapons were fired and no fleets moved into formation. Because at that point, every admiral and every soldier already believed that there was no point in trying to fight and that any attempt at war would end in complete destruction. And so the empire simply stood still and waited for what the human ship would do next. And a long, silent pause fell over every planet and every city and every ship and every mind, and this silence was so deep that some people later said it was like the galaxy itself stopped breathing and waited for a judgment that could not be avoided. And this was the moment when the human ship stopped moving for the first time, and this created even more terror because some people believed that when the ship finally stopped, it meant that whatever happened next would change everything. And some people in secret prayed to the humans because they believed that the humans were gods who had returned, and some people whispered that humans were devils who had returned to destroy everything. And some people whispered that humans had simply become something that was far beyond any word or idea that living minds had. And this argument did not matter in the end, because when the ship transmitted its next message, the argument ended and the message said, "We will not destroy you. We only came to see if this place still existed." And then the message said, "We will leave soon." And this message was so strange that some people felt more fear than before, because the message was not a promise of peace, and not a promise of mercy, and not a promise of alliance, and not a promise of safety. And it sounded like the humans were indifferent to everything inside this galaxy. And this was worse than destruction, because destruction means you matter to the destroyer, but indifference means you are so small, you do not even need to be destroyed. And this realization hit the empire with more force than any weapon could ever hit it, And the emperor cried alone in his chamber because the idea that humans did not care about the empire meant that the empire was not a rival, and not a victim, and not a threat, but nothing, and the emperor said that this was the real death of the empire because the empire existed only to prove power, and now that the humans showed that power is meaningless, the empire had no purpose left. And in the analysis rooms, the scientists looked at new readings and saw that the human ship had started preparing a jump sequence. And this jump sequence was unlike any known mechanism, because normal jump drives use anchor points and coordinates. But this ship was not anchoring to anything, and not calculating a path and not requesting space permissions, and the ship simply started bending space around itself as if the universe was a sheet of cloth that could be folded by hand. And one scientist whispered that humans do not travel through space anymore because they travel through reality, and this whisper felt like it came from a different age of thinking. And this whisper made everyone in the room feel like children who had only just learned how to crawl while humans were running through dimensions like gods. And when the jump sequence reached a certain point, the hull of the ship faded into darkness like a shadow that was being erased from existence, and the ship vanished, and there was no explosion, and no flash, and no trace. And the scanner showed nothing, and the empire just sat there in shock and confusion and emptiness. And some people asked each other if this was really real, and some said they had dreamed it, and some said the ship had never existed at all and that everything was a mass hallucination. But that was not true because the memory of the message remained burned into military records, and the message was now part of history. And the message said that humans had left the galaxy long ago and had returned only to look at it and to see if anything had changed, and then they left again without taking anything, and without demanding anything, and without killing anything. And this event was recorded by historians as the second human contact event, and this event became the most feared and most studied incident in all recorded history, because it proved that humans were not only alive but also had reached a state of existence that made every other species look primitive and small. And the historians wrote that this event was the moment when the empire stopped being a superpower, because a superpower must be feared and respected, and humans did not fear the empire and did not respect the empire, because humans did not even look at the empire as something important. And when a civilization is ignored by a greater civilization, then that civilization loses its pride, and when it loses its pride, it loses its identity, and the empire fell into a slow despair after the human ship vanished and people stopped believing in the empire, and rebellions no longer fought, and revolts no longer protested because nobody wanted to rule anymore and nobody wanted to resist anymore, because there was no point in ruling something that humans could take away with one blink, and there was no point in resisting something that did not even care to look at you. And the emperor later resigned because he said he could not lead a world that had no purpose because